Jessica Parker had always been a responsible and loving daughter. At 17, she was preparing for a future she hadn't expected, motherhood. Though the news of her pregnancy had been a shock, she embraced it with quiet determination. Her parents, Lisa and David Parker, stood by her, offering their full support. They had been hesitant at first, worried about how she would manage, but Jessica assured them she was ready. She had always been strong-willed, and if she said she would make it work, they believed her. The night she disappeared was supposed to be like any other. Jessica had gone to a prenatal checkup that afternoon and then met up with a friend for coffee. She texted her mother around 6 in the evening, saying she was on her way home. Lisa had replied with a simple, "Drive safe, love you," not knowing it would be the last message she'd ever send to her daughter. When Jessica didn't arrive home within the hour, Lisa wasn't immediately alarmed. Maybe she had stopped somewhere, maybe traffic was bad, but as time passed with no response to calls or texts, unease crept in. By 10 o'clock, worry turned into panic. David tried to stay calm, reasoning that maybe Jessica had fallen asleep at a friend's house. But Lisa knew better. Jessica wouldn't ignore them, not with her due date so close. Something was wrong. They called her friends, but no one had seen or heard from her since earlier that evening. They drove around town, retracing the route she would have taken home. The streets were dark and empty, the night air thick with tension. Every time Lisa's phone buzzed, she held her breath, hoping it was Jessica, but each time it was someone else. Friends asking if she had turned up yet, neighbors offering to help search. By midnight, they reported her missing. The police took the report but didn't seem overly concerned at first. Teenagers went missing all the time, they said. Maybe she had run away or needed space. Lisa and David knew that wasn't true. Jessica had been excited about becoming a mother. She had just set up the baby's crib that morning. She wouldn't have left on her own. The next day, volunteers helped put up missing posters. Social media flooded with Jessica's photo, urging people to keep an eye out. Days passed and still there was nothing. The police finally took the case seriously when Jessica's car was found abandoned in a parking lot near her doctor's office. Her purse was still inside, along with her phone, but there was no sign of her. Then, a week later, the call came. A jogger had discovered something in a wooded area outside town. Lisa and David rushed to the scene, their hearts pounding. Yellow tape marked the area where officers stood in grim silence. When Lisa saw the familiar jacket lying near the disturbed earth, she collapsed. Jessica had been found, but not the way they had prayed for. The crime scene was unlike anything the investigators had expected. Jessica's body had been hastily buried in a shallow grave, her lifeless form partially exposed by the elements. The jogger who had stumbled upon her had initially thought it was a discarded mannequin, but a closer look revealed the horrifying truth. Her skin was pale, her clothes torn, and her body bore the unmistakable marks of violence. Detectives arrived quickly, securing the area while forensic teams carefully examined the scene. The bruises on Jessica's wrists suggested she had been restrained, possibly tied up for hours before her death. The most chilling discovery, however, was the state of her abdomen. A deep incision had been made, and the baby she had been carrying for 8 months was gone. The crude nature of the cut indicated that whoever had done this was not a medical professional. There were no signs that the procedure had been done with care. It had been rushed, brutal, and without concern for Jessica's life. The realization sent shockwaves through the investigative team. This was no ordinary murder. Someone had deliberately taken Jessica's baby, leaving her to die in the woods like she was nothing. The question was, who would do such a thing, and why? Detectives immediately turned to those closest to her. Jessica's parents were devastated, barely able to speak through their grief. Lisa clutched her daughter's childhood blanket as she sobbed, while David sat in stunned silence, his hands shaking. They couldn't understand why anyone would want to hurt Jessica. She had no enemies. If she had been in danger, she would have told them, wouldn't she? The focus shifted to Ryan Carter, Jessica's ex-boyfriend and the baby's father. He had distanced himself when she told him she was pregnant, making it clear he wanted nothing to do with the child. But was that enough motive for murder? When detectives questioned him, he seemed genuinely shocked by Jessica's death. He swore he hadn't seen her in weeks and provided an alibi for the night she went missing. It checked out, ruling him out as a suspect, for now. Investigators scoured security footage from the area where Jessica's car had been found. That's when they spotted something unusual. A dark-colored van had been parked near the clinic on the day of her disappearance. It sat idle for over an hour, its engine running, as if the driver was waiting for someone. Witnesses recalled seeing a woman nearby, pacing nervously. She wasn't a patient or a staff member, and no one recognized her. Detectives traced Jessica's last phone calls, hoping for a clue. One number stood out, a series of calls and messages from an unknown contact in the days leading up to her death. When they dug deeper, they found the name attached to it, Elaine Carter. The surname immediately raised suspicion. She was Ryan's estranged aunt, someone Jessica had never mentioned before. What was her connection to Jessica? And more importantly, where was the baby? Jessica's parents had never seen the notebook before. It was small, tucked away in a drawer beneath baby clothes, as if she had wanted to keep it hidden. When detectives flipped through its pages, they found a side of Jessica no one had known. A girl who had been afraid, paranoid, and convinced that someone was watching her. The entries began as typical pregnancy notes filled with excitement and anticipation. She wrote about baby names, cravings, and how she couldn't wait to hold her child. But as the weeks passed, the tone of her writing changed. She mentioned feeling like someone was following her, always at a distance, but never close enough to identify. One entry stood out. Jessica described a strange encounter at a coffee shop. A woman had approached her, smiling warmly, and asked how far along she was. At first, Jessica thought she was just being friendly, but then the questions became unsettling. Was she scared to be a young mother? Had she considered adoption? Did she have anyone to help her? Jessica had felt uncomfortable and left quickly, but the encounter left her shaken. She had written, "Something about her wasn't right. She kept touching my belly. I felt trapped." Another entry mentioned receiving a phone call from an unknown number. The woman on the other end had asked if Jessica had ever thought about giving up her baby. She didn't introduce herself, and when Jessica asked who she was, she hung up. The last entry was the most disturbing. It was dated just a few days before Jessica's disappearance. She wrote, "I think I'm being watched. The same van has been near the clinic twice. Someone called me again today but didn't say anything. I'm probably just being paranoid, but I can't shake the feeling that something bad is going to happen." Detectives now had a name, Elaine Carter. She was Ryan's estranged aunt, a woman who had no known connection to Jessica. Until now. When they dug into her past, a disturbing history emerged. Elaine had once worked as a nurse, but had lost her job due to accusations of negligence. She had suffered multiple miscarriages and, years ago, had lost custody of her own children due to mental instability. Her financial records revealed a troubling pattern. She had recently made online searches about black market adoptions and had purchased medical supplies, including surgical gloves and scalpels. Even more chilling, detectives found security footage of her van at the same coffee shop Jessica had mentioned in her journal. It was becoming clear that Elaine had been obsessed with Jessica's baby. She had been watching, waiting, and planning. But what had pushed her to take such a monstrous step? Detectives tracked her down to a remote house on the outskirts of town. The blinds were drawn and the place looked abandoned, but they had a feeling she was inside. They had one question weighing on their minds as they prepared to move in. Was the baby still alive? The house was eerily quiet when detectives arrived. The small, run-down structure sat at the edge of a wooded area, partially hidden by overgrown bushes. The windows were covered with blankets, blocking any view inside. There was no movement, no sound, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Detectives knocked on the door, but there was no response. They called out Elaine Carter's name, warning her that they had a warrant. Still, silence. Fearing for the worst, officers forced their way inside. The air was thick with an unfamiliar, sterile smell. Antiseptic mixed with something musty. The living room was cluttered with baby supplies. Unopened packs of diapers, bottles still in their packaging, and a crib in the corner. The walls were decorated with pastel-colored baby posters, as if someone had been preparing for a child. But something felt disturbingly off. As detectives moved deeper into the house, they heard a faint sound, a soft, whimpering cry. Their hearts pounded as they followed it down the hall to a dimly lit bedroom. There, lying in a makeshift bassinet, was a tiny newborn baby. The child was wrapped in a pink blanket, eyes barely open, breathing weak but steady. The baby was alive. Elaine was nowhere in sight, but the evidence in the house told a horrifying story. On a table near the bed, detectives found a blood-stained scalpel, surgical gloves, and medical gauze. Nearby was a half-written letter, its words chilling. "I finally have my baby. No one will take her from me this time." Officers spread out, searching every room, until one of them spotted movement outside, a figure running toward the woods. Elaine had been hiding in the backyard, watching the police from the shadows. When she realized they had found the baby, she tried to flee. A short chase ensued before officers tackled her to the ground. She screamed, kicking and thrashing, her voice filled with desperation. "She's mine! I saved her! Jessica didn't deserve her!" Her words sent a wave of revulsion through the officers. There was no remorse, no regret, only a twisted sense of entitlement. Back at the house, paramedics examined the baby, confirming she was malnourished but stable. Jessica's parents were notified immediately, and Lisa broke down in tears when she heard the news. Though they had lost their daughter, a piece of her had been saved. Elaine was taken into custody, her expression blank as she was escorted into a police car. The case against her was overwhelming. Phone records, surveillance footage, Jessica's journal, and now the baby herself. She had planned everything meticulously, stalking Jessica for weeks, waiting for the right moment to strike. The nightmare was far from over, but at least one question had been answered. Jessica's baby had survived, but the scars of what had happened would remain forever. Now, justice had to be served. Elaine Carter's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. News of Jessica's murder and the horrifying details surrounding her baby's abduction spread quickly, leaving people in disbelief. How could someone commit such an unspeakable act? Elaine had shown no remorse during her interrogation. She claimed she had done what was necessary, insisting that Jessica had been unfit to be a mother. Her delusions were clear. She had convinced herself that the baby was hers, that she had simply taken back what she believed she deserved.
Jessica's parents, Lisa and David, were overwhelmed with emotions. They had spent days trapped in grief, mourning the brutal loss of their daughter, and now they had to shift their focus to fighting for their granddaughter. The baby, named Hope, was still in the hospital, recovering from the trauma of her first few days of life. Lisa held her for the first time, feeling a mix of joy and heartbreak. Hope was so small, so fragile, yet she had survived something so horrific. As the investigation continued, more disturbing details emerged. Elaine had been researching pregnant teenagers for months, searching for a vulnerable victim. When she came across Jessica, she saw the perfect opportunity. She had followed her, learned her routines, and gained enough information to manipulate her into a trap. The coffee shop encounter, the phone calls, and the van near the clinic had all been part of her plan. Jessica had sensed danger but hadn't realized how close it truly was. The trial was swift with overwhelming evidence against Elaine. She was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and aggravated assault. In court, Jessica's parents spoke through tears, demanding justice for their daughter. The prosecution painted Elaine as a manipulative and dangerous woman, one who had planned and executed a crime so horrific that it had left an entire town shaken. Elaine's defense tried to argue that she was mentally ill, incapable of fully understanding her actions, but the jury saw through it. She had been methodical, calculated, and entirely aware of what she was doing. After weeks of testimony, the verdict was reached, guilty on all charges. Elaine Carter was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Justice had been served, but for Lisa and David, the pain would never fully fade. They had lost their only daughter in the most brutal way imaginable, but they had gained a piece of her in hope. Every time they looked into the baby's eyes, they saw Jessica, a reminder of her love, her strength, and the future she had been robbed of. Years later, Lisa and David shared their story, hoping to raise awareness about pregnancy crimes. They wanted Jessica's story to serve as a warning that sometimes danger doesn't come from a stranger in the dark, but from someone quietly watching, waiting, and planning. Jessica's life had been stolen, but her legacy lived on. Hope grew up surrounded by love, knowing that her mother had fought for her until the very end, and through her, Jessica's spirit remained unbroken and everlasting.